My name's Dave Rohrl, little consulting company, Mobile Game Doctor. This is Jim Wagner from Eastside Games. We are excited to tell you a little bit about some of our work designing and creating Trailer Park Boys, Greasy Money, and how we defined some of the conventional rules of idle game design and how it went from there. I've been in the business for a long time, done a lot of things, 23 years altogether, so, you know, before all of you were out of diapers, clearly. He never got out of diapers. Been focused on the free-to-play world for the last 9 years or so, since early 2009. And these days, working with a number of other veteran designers to help create and turn around projects on free-to-play mobile games worldwide. Oh, and I came in on Trailer Park Boys to help pull a good design together for the team.
Thanks, Dave. Hi, everyone. My name is Jim Wagner. I'm a producer with 8 years experience in mobile free-to-play. And I'm with Eastside Games. We're a Vancouver-based mobile free-to-play studio, and we're bootstrapped and profitable. I was a lead producer on Trailer Park Boys Greasy Money, and we shipped this year on 4/20, which was not an accident. And I love idle games. And today I'm going to talk to you about this idle game, which is Trailer Park Boys Greasy Money. It's an idle business simulator, and when we launched it, it was the #1 app in Canada, and in the US, on iOS and Android, it was #4 and #8, respectively. It's been in the top 100 charts for over 100 countries. And I'm going to talk to you about how did we achieve this with a niche IP and an idle game. So first, a little bit about the IP. Just show of hands, how many people have watched an episode of Trailer Park Boys? Two in the back. That's pretty good. That's about what I'd expect. You know, it was a niche IP. That was one of the things we knew going into it. For those of you that don't know, it's a mockumentary about shitty Canadian criminals in a Nova Scotia trailer park. It debuted in 2001 on a Canadian specialty channel, and it was recently revived on Netflix and discovered a new audience. We'd like to say it's, I think, the most Canadian collaboration in the history of mobile games. They're on the east coast of Canada. We're on the west coast. We're both extremely Canadian, but in different ways. And it was a blast to work with them. Though, as I mentioned, it was a niche IP. So one of the things we wanted to do was get something quick to market and really measure what the audience was for it. So Trailer Park Boys V1 was an idle tapper game. So similar to something like Tap Titans or Make It Rain, where you're tapping away and you're stealing meat from a grocery store, siphoning gas from cop cars or flipping off cops, kind of really greasy, no-collar crime, I called it. It used a lot of the common idle conventions, resets, ascension currency, cash upgrades, because we wanted to get something up quick. It was appealed to everyone. It was, we built it because for fans and non-fans. We didn't want to limit it. It was not very good also. It was really, really bad. I think in our quest to get something out quick and relying on conventions, we ended up not serving the fan and the IP. You know, we kind of took these mechanics and tried to jam this IP on top of them, and it ended up not being a good scene at all. But there were bits about it that we really liked, things that really resonated with us, and we loved the IP. So we said, we want to do this again. So we reinvented it as an idle simulation game. We redefined our audience as the super fans of the show. We were going to make something for the fans this time, keep ourselves focused. And the stakes were higher, so we knew we were going into a longer development cycle. We really needed to nail this. We had to frame, and we took that from the beginning. We framed our development and said, you know, we need to take the story and the IP and make mechanics that fit that rather than the other way around. And this is where Dave came on. We've been talking back and forth for some time, and this was a perfect project to collaborate on because the stakes were high and a lot of expectations. And talking, we both kind of decided we were going to have to break, or at least bend, some of the rules of idle games. So what are those rules? Well, number one, idle games typically don't have story. Number two, idle games usually have some free-form gameplay, kind of sandboxy elements to them. And three, idle games have low arc down. And that was a big one for us because we were committing to a longer development cycle. We still didn't really know the size of the audience. But at the same time, we didn't have the resources to make a hardcore card battler or the audience. So I'm going to talk to you first about rule number one, idle games don't have story. Why was this a problem for us? Because the IP just had such a wealth of characters and stories. You've got stoned cougars and shotgun-wielding veterinarians and mustard tigers. We really wanted to show that off. But we felt constrained by the first and the V1 version. We had kind of an open system, and it was really hard to tell linear stories. And we had all these linear stories. That was the bread and butter of the IP. You had, the boys are constantly getting out of jail, and they have new schemes to do. You have antagonist showdowns with, drunk trailer park supervisors and these antagonists that are harassing you. Or you have a greasy grade 9 dropout who kidnaps your hard-partying goldfish and holds them at gunpoint. We really wanted to get these in the game, so how did we do that? Well, we built this thing that we call the plot point tool. It's a designer tool built in Unity that allows a designer to create these cutscenes without any art or coder support. And what we did with that is we just started cramming these cutscenes, this story, everywhere we could in the game. Any kind of hook we could find to hang it on. And what we found coming out of that was story is a really great reward in an idle game for idle game players. They really appreciate it. I think and we saw this in our playtests, players would actually vocalize when they got to a grindy part in a season, I just want to see what happens next. I'm just going to keep playing because I want to see how this story ends. Or we mentioned it in that other talk, it was the commercial breaks at the end of the TV show. We kind of removed that friction. You go right from one story in the next one, and players were vocalizing, I just want to play one more. And it was very much, if you've ever accidentally watched 5 seasons of The Office on Netflix, it was a very similar experience. Players were binging on our game. And we had that golden playtest moment you're looking for when the playtest was over, but they just didn't leave. They just kind of sat in their chairs, and we had to, physically pry the devices out of their games because they just wanted to keep playing. And some of the results of that were, I'd say, the best ratings and the best retention I've seen on a product at launch. The fans really love it. There were days in our golden cohort where we saw 80% day one retention. So I'm just going to wrap it up with the kind of the wins and losses of breaking that kind of, idle games don't have story rule. Story is a great reward. It's a cheap reward from a system and asset point of view. There is no power creep on story. You can keep delivering more and more and more story without the risk of upsetting an economic system or destroying a core loop, and the players respond just as well. It was a great way to have measurable progression in our game, and I think in a lot of idle games, it's a little bit fuzzy. Your numbers are getting bigger, but there's not really a thing that a track you're progressing on. And a common vocalization from players was, what season are you on? And they would compare their progress in the game. It was also a huge fan service success. I think one of the risks we saw with this was that the fans weren't going to accept an idle game. They were expecting us to make Grand Theft Auto Sunnyvale, which was not something we could make or even wanted to make. That's not our skill set. But I think by doubling down on story, we were able to bring a lot of those players that have never even played an idle game or thought about it into the genre, and they loved it. Some of the losses, it required a new skill set, and it was labor intensive. We didn't have any writers at the studio, and this required a lot of writing. We had to figure that out. I think a big risk with a free-to-play game was we had an end of content. There's a point in the game where you play through all the stories, and you have to wait to get more stories. And that's something that we saw as a big risk. Still kind of is a big risk, but we're kind of keeping ahead of it by adding more and more content. And then kind of, looking forward in the future is there a finite number of stories to tell in this universe? What do we do at that point? And I'm going to pass that over to Dave, and he's going to talk about rule number 2.
Idle games have free-form gameplay. So in most idle games, a lot of decisions devolve to the player in terms of how they want to allocate resources without a lot of guidance. And, this can lead to some design awkwardness. One of the things that was quite awkward for us, we felt like we had a lot of great TPB stories to tell, but in a typical idle game, there aren't a lot of great insertion points to hang those on. Our first thought was to create little vignettes about the characters or the businesses that would stand alone and attach them to achievements, like you see here in Clicker Heroes. But there were a number of problems with that particular approach. The first was that achievements often aren't very evenly spaced. They tend to come fast and furious early in a game by design, and then become farther and farther and farther apart. And it would be really hard for players to anticipate a consistent pace of storytelling. The second was, we really felt like if we built this kind of structure, we had an obligation to convey to the player what they could expect and when, which meant building extra screens that would show the player where all these achievements were, and which ones had story, and which ones didn't, and which ones they had seen. And since we are allergic to work, we didn't want to do that. And there's really no way to guarantee what order a player will complete achievements in. There's a typical progression, but nothing guaranteed, which meant that we couldn't really tell a linear story. We could only have snippets. Another design problem we wanted to solve for was what I call the ascension problem. So all idle games have an ascension mechanic. When the player progress is ground to a halt, they restart with some bonuses and play through again. And the game feels fresh and exciting because you can make lots of progress after grinding to a halt. But most idle games give the player total authority over when they want to ascend. So you have to parse some weird math, like, is this a good time to ascend? What about this? Is this a good time to ascend? I mean, you get quattuor vigintillions of angels, whatever the hell those are. None of us felt great about this particular bug in the design of a typical idle game, so we wanted to solve for it. So we decided to get 2 birds stoned at once, give ourselves some linear storytelling, remove the awkwardness of ascension, with a design structure that we called seasons. Right? We wanted to tell linear stories with a beginning, middle, and end, so we created a gameplay structure with a beginning, middle, and end where we could insert those stories. So we wanted to communicate to the user where they were and how they were progressing through that path to the next reset. So we created goals, simple things that we asked the player to achieve and tried to put in an interesting sequence. Build up a particular business, build up your cash resources, up-level characters. As the player completes these, they trigger cutscenes. When they complete enough, they can ascend and go into a quick tapping boss fight versus usually some sort of law enforcement figure. Inevitably, this ends with the boys going to jail and all of their businesses falling apart, perhaps because they're trying to fight gun-toting lawmen by flipping them the bird. Often not a great strategy. So this did some great stuff for us and created some interesting challenges. On the upside, it gave us a nice, predictable cadence of content delivery. So we knew we could throw the content out there at a pace and in a way that would keep players interested and engaged over the long term. The goals actually turned out to be a huge win in and of themselves. Often, idle gameplay can feel very undifferentiated, where you're just sort of throwing money at stuff. Here, we're asking you to focus on different things in different sequences. It gives the gameplay a nice strategic feel, where you're marshaling resources towards a specific goal. We got rid of the messy decision of when to ascend by really regulating that for the player, giving them a timer they could drive towards. And we also wound up creating a story around the seasons. You go to jail, all the businesses fall apart, you have to restart, that went with a necessary design piece. Those things feel aligned, it's intuitive for the player, and press has really picked up on that, as have players. On the downside, every single goal, every single season is handcrafted content. right? None of this is algorithmically generated. We have designers sitting and working through these things piece by piece. That means it takes a long time, takes us about a day per season to handcraft that stuff. That has cost, that has tedium. It's a bit of a process. Another rule that we wanted to break was that idle games have low ARPDAU, average revenue per daily active user. So the R in ARPDAU stands for revenue, and this is something that idle games are generally pretty bad at. Future Play, a Finnish outfit that makes Farm Away and Build Away, had a huge press push around the fact that they were making 8 cents per user per day. This is crap. This is less than half of what I am driving for in a typical casual game. It's really bad ARPDAU. And as it happens, we like money. So we took a look around at what was working on the App Store in terms of monetization and decided we wanted to push into a gacha system where we felt like we could drive good depth of monetization, took some inspiration from Clash Royale, which has been a huge success, and said, okay, we know that our players love the Trailer Park Boys characters. That's where we want to anchor the gacha system. We built a fairly standard set of mechanics around it. You get random card drops. You have to get so many cards for a particular character to level them up. You also need to kick in liquor, a secondary currency, which one of my favorite currencies, by the way. I like liquor. We linked that to a time drop that happens every 4 hours. So it gave players a great reason to sort of come back, get their liquor so they could upgrade their characters. Once we built this system, we knew we needed to make it central to gameplay so players would actually invest in it and monetize through it. So we gated the automation to the businesses on character levels. If players want to progress, they want to automate, they need to engage with the gacha. As with any design, there's some trade-offs there. On the plus side, the monetization's been great. Our ARPDAU is about double what you would expect from a good idle game, and at pretty good scale. The 4-hour callback cycle was a huge success. It gave us a great reason to tell players to come back to the game that most idle games lack. We also added strategic depth here. Players have to make resource management decisions about where and how to spend their liquor. Do they want to hoard? Do they want to be profligate? Do they want to drive up profits early or wait for automation? On the downside, the fact that there's a critical currency that's tightly linked to a time drop meant that players that log in more frequently have a lot more flexibility in the game, can do a lot more, can progress a lot faster, can pile up big multipliers that never go away. It also meant that, unlike most idle games, we had very little way of forecasting what a player state looked like at a certain age. After 30 days, the character upgrades that players have done diverge very, very widely. And we were using handcrafted content to regulate process. Instead of letting the player decide when the game was too slow, we made a commitment to the player to keep the pace moving, to keep the game going against a non-deterministic player state. And that turned out to be a really complex and difficult problem to solve well. And I'd say it's pretty good, but an imperfect solution still.
So to recap, just running through the rules we unbroked, we proved with this game that idle games can have story, structured ascension, and good ARPDAU. So what's next is more content. We're continuously adding new seasons, new characters, new story, new businesses to the game to kind of keep that treadmill of stories going for players. We recently launched a limited time events feature, and we're running that with kind of a season that you play for a limited time and you can win an exclusive character. And just we've run 3 events so far. We ran one on the weekend, and we found that it increases our ARPDAU and video ad views often by up to 3 times. More features we're looking at: customizable costumes for characters, leaderboards and competitive events, and social features. And finally, we're also looking at more platforms. We know that the idle genre often does well on desktop, so we're looking at Facebook Game Room, which actually should be launching very soon, Congregate, and Steam. And we're also looking ahead to game number 2. We know that we could bring this system to a different audience and see some more successes. So that's something we're looking at, both kind of internal and external IPs, and looking for partnerships there. And shameless plug, we're also hiring. And he's also hiring too.
Hire us. Hire us.
Both Eastside Games and Mobile Game Doctor are both hiring. And I'm especially looking for anyone that wants to chat about live operations. That's something I'm very interested in, moving this game into a live operations model.
And just for clarity, I'm not super hiring, but certainly looking for folks that need design help where we can plug our experts in and solve problems.
You are being hired.
Exactly.
You're looking for.
Exactly.
Yes. He's a great guy. And that's it. Thank you very much.
I have a couple of questions. One on the narrative front. Did you write original stories or did you recycle stories from the TV show?
So we did both. We kind of pitched this universe as non-canon. So sometimes we retell a story, sometimes we kind of do a pseudo-sequel to a story, sometimes we do completely new stories.
And on the ARPDAO, was the higher ARPDAO mostly due to just people watching more ads than in a typical idle game? Or people buying in-app purchases?
In-app purchases. I think our video ad numbers are healthy, but we're not more than other idle games, I don't think. The only time I would say is during events, we do see really high ad ARPDAO.
Yeah, the revenue mix in the game skews much more heavily towards IAP than a typical idle game. I think in large part because of the need for that secondary currency, additional card drops, the whole gotcha system drives a lot of that.
Hey, guys, you said that you developed a 4-hour callback. Was that luck? Did you do A/B testing? Did you do some other kind of mechanism to pick 4 hours?
I think that's force of habit. You know, I used to do Facebook games, so 4 hours is sort of burned in there fairly deeply. We put it in as a first approximation, and it worked pretty well.
Yeah, I think for me, we do have a number of callback timers in the game, and 4 hours just kind of felt right.
Hey, guys, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. I appreciate it.